On a rural road in Canada a few Octobers ago, I pulled the car over to stare at two long-legged animals loping confidently through an adjacent field. They trotted nonchalantly along, not far from several dozen unconcerned cows. I'd never seen a wolf outside a national park before, but I knew instantly what they were. When I lowered my window, the pair of wolves stopped and stared directly at my vehicle. There was an assertiveness in their look. They belonged on the land. As I admired the luster of their coats and the muscled curve of their haunches, I felt my place in the world shift just a notch. The feeling was uplifting, but at the same time, mildly disorienting. I had not expected them there. Something in my mind had to shift. The wolves finally grew tired of looking, bumped shoulders, and resumed their lope across the field. I drove the car back onto the road with electricity coursing through my blood. The feeling did not fade for many miles. It persists in the pages of this book.
Hello, and a warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're endeavouring to inject a little optimism into a rather doleful time. That said, we don't want to be misleading you into thinking that there is something in full-blown celebratory mode about the biodiversity crisis that we're all facing. That would be irresponsible and inaccurate. However, our guest today is much too savvy to fall into such a trap of delusional fantasy. Professor Christopher Preston is Professor of Environmental Philosophy at the University of Montana, and he is, above all, a realist about wildlife populations, which have declined 20% in the last century. He knows that in addition to the 900 species that have been wiped off the planet since industrialization, 1 million more are facing extinction. Bird and insect populations are also plummeting, a situation only worsened by climate change. However, despite all these depressing facts, Preston has elected to focus on the fragments of good news that are occurring in his new book, Tenacious Beasts. He says his purpose is to, quote, offer a roadmap and a measure of hope for the future, a future in which humans and animals can once again coexist. So, Christopher, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
Thank you for this book, which I have to say is delightful to read. It's got all that kind of careful nuance of nature writing combined with the scientific facts. Perhaps before we get into the very big questions, we could maybe start with you reading from the opening section, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, thank you. First few lines of the book here. Standing on the dock in the dead of Arctic winter, Schweinandus closed his eyes to the northern lights above. All the professor wanted to do right now was listen. As the mountains and green aurora faded from his retina, the sound of a gently rippling ocean washed over his body. Seconds after his mind quieted, he heard the splash of a large object, followed by a fierce exhalation of air. Then he heard another, then another. A fishy scent wafted shorewards. Casting his head back to the sky, Schweinandus' mouth cracked open as he drank in the frigid nighttime air. He was perched on the doorstep of whales, dozens and dozens of whales, humpback and killer whales drawn to Norway's Kaldfjord in the winter months to feast on herring.
Well, that's beautiful writing. So what does this little anecdote tell us about whale recovery, Christopher?
Yeah, so a few years ago, these fjords, which are on the northern tip of Norway, right where it kind of bends around to Russia, suddenly filled up with whales, really like brimming over with whales. It wasn't quite true that you could walk across the fjord on the backs of whales, but it was pretty close. I've got a friend who lives on the fjord up there, and she said if she didn't have her windows closed at night, she couldn't sleep. There were so many whales. Now, this is a whale recovery of really dramatic and inspiring proportions. So this is the North Atlantic population of humpback whales. And that North Atlantic population has gone up from about 1,000 40 or 50 years ago when whaling ended to 35,000 now. And closer to my neck of the woods here in the northwest of the United States, the Pacific population of humpback whales has gone up from about 1,200 to 26,000. And so these whales are actually perfect examples of what I call in this book, tenacious beasts. So what makes you a tenacious beast is if you have stared extinction in the face, if you've come really close to extinction, and then something's turned around and gone right, and you've come back from the brink. That's what makes you a tenacious beast. And so I wanted to track down a few of these animals. And so I found them on farms. And Andrew, if you can pitch a slide up there. I found them on farms where I looked at wolves and deer and boar. Next slide, please. I found them on prairie where I investigated plains bison and pronghorn antelope. Next slide. I found them in rivers where I looked at beaver recovery and salmon recovery. I found them in forests where I looked at the recovery of the Mexican bear, and I looked at some owl species. And then finally, I found them in oceans where I looked at the humpback whale and I looked at the sea otter. And so the idea was to shine a light on species that are doing well in order to perhaps shift something in how we think about wildlife.
So I think perhaps some of us witnessed some of this during the lockdown, where there was a kind of return to certain, or even an encroachment on our space by some of these animals. I remember seeing pictures of sheep walking around towns in England and goats. Just because there was nobody out on the streets, they just decided to reclaim space. But on the other hand, skeptics would say that these rather anecdotal examples are lovely, but really aren't they just a drop in the ocean? No pun intended there. Because the combined urban sprawl and loss of habitat for animals, combined with pesticides, plastics, etc., haven't they all conspired against any real significant success?
So, this is a good point. And I want to be clear about this book. I'm not being starry-eyed and imagining there isn't a biodiversity crisis. And I say this kind of really clearly in the introduction, that the biodiversity crisis is real. And so nothing I write should convince people that that's a myth. But I think it's very important for us to shine a light on the species that are doing well. So one reason is it provides hope. It gives us an image and a sense and a feeling of what is possible. And, if you want to motivate action, I think hope is a really good motivator of action. Another thing that I think it does, and I sort of learned this as I was investigating these species, is animals want to live. Animals want to recover. And so when you track species that come back, you're really learning something about how biology works. If we kind of take our foot off the gas, if we give animals a bit of space, they come back. And this is what you mentioned, Mary, about COVID. When we were all closed up inside, it was surprising that they're out there in those numbers, and we were all delighted that they're out there in those numbers, and they began to explore territory that they hadn't been able to explore for a while. So I think there's a sense in which when you learn about the resilience and the tenacity of animals, that's actually true to biology. Biology is exploratory. Species are looking for opportunities to adapt and to survive and to reproduce. And so I think there's something that's very kind of true to biology when you look at recovering species. And then I'll just say one more thing about, not wanting to mislead people. If you do look at a species that's coming back, especially one that's been absent for, a century or so, you get a chance to look at it with fresh eyes. You get a chance to look at it with the science of 2023 and also with the techniques of 2023 for coexisting with that animal. And I think too often we tend to have an outdated conception of wildlife. And so I think recovering wildlife give you a chance to look at them afresh and perhaps come away with a different idea of what these species are.
So I understand what you mean about the looking afresh in terms of our perception, like certain animals get such a bad rap, the big bad wolf, the mythology. And I think that's starting to change a little bit. But what do you mean by the techniques, changing our techniques?
So, learning how to live with an animal, it requires a little bit of skill and a little bit of adaptation. And think what's available to us now in terms of tracking wolves and kind of knowing where they are. In some cases you have alpha males or alpha females with radio collars on. So you know where they are, you know how they behave if a particular pair is removed from a pack because there's been some predation or something like that. We know what we can do on the landscape to help live alongside them. And so things like range riders who are out there on the landscape, keeping an eye on livestock, flaggery, which is a certain type of flagging that scares wolves away. We just have better habits and practices in order to coexist with animals. And so, we're not living in 1890, we're living in 2023. And I think there's more available here to learn, to facilitate coexistence.
I want so much to believe you about all this because, it was so pleasing that the short documentary film went to the Elephant Whisperer, which I'm dying to see, which was a documentary about people that have really learned to understand elephants or kind of be copacetic with them. So let's go back to you before we talk again about how you broke the book down into the chapters and why you chose to do that. So you've got a background as a science journalist because you write for quite a few publications, including the BBC. And now you're an environmental philosopher, which in itself I'd like you to explain because I don't think there's too many places in America that there's departments of that. And then you were a former commercial fisherman. So how did all of this inform what you do now?
Yeah, good question. So I think I would say my day job is I teach at university. I do environmental philosophy. And environmental philosophy is looking at, what might be an appropriate relationship between humans and their environment, right? Environmental philosophy. And so often the environment there means the natural environment, but it also means the human environment. There is an environmental philosophy of cities. There's an environmental philosophy of rural areas. It's just sort of thinking about proper relationships, thinking about good ways to categorize our surroundings, and thinking about how to react to changes in our surroundings. This is what environmental philosophy is. Now, the whole time I was studying to be an environmental philosopher, and that's kind of a long story. It began in England, where I was at the University of Durham, and then it moved to Colorado, where I was at Colorado State University, and then the University of Oregon. But the whole time I was studying to be an environmental philosopher, I was taking summers off. All of my colleagues were spending summers in the library. I was taking summers off to go to Alaska. And being, an Englishman from the south coast of England, where most of the wildlife that I would get to see was a few bunny rabbits and foxes, to find myself in Alaska on the deck of a fishing vessel in Prince William Sound just blew my mind. One day I'd be handing in my finals at my university, and the next day I'd be on a boat with killer whales moving beside the boat, and bears on the beach, and sea lions chomping down on salmon kind of next to the boat. And it just left me with an incredible sense of the vitality of the living world, just the sort of raw energy and power of that world. And I just was never able to shake the power of wildlife from my mind. And so obviously, I got educated in this time of environmental crisis, which can be very depressing. But I've noticed in the last few years, and this is how I kind of got to the book, in the last few years, there have been these glimmers of good news. There have been more stories about species that have been recovering. There have been stories about changes in land use that are encouraging to wildlife. And I thought, this is an interesting narrative to kind of shine a light on, to kind of help sort of shift people out of an entirely negative mindset and to start to look for possibilities.
Well, there's a lot in that. First of all, philosophy, where as it applies to cities, etc., one tends to think of it not being so much philosophy as city planning. And, the philosophy and what people want has definitely been a belated interest of how things shape out. Generally, it's like we build these dreadful tower blocks with no green space, and everyone goes, oh, the suicide rate's going up. Everyone's having violent crimes. Could it be the environment? So I raise that because, you're on indigenous land, and does it not call into question? It does to me, I know, and I'm not in your field, how differently the landscape would look had we not thrown out the indigenous thinking along with the indigenous people about good stewardship and management. And do you see any of that coming back in these practices?
Oh, so I absolutely do. And, one of the things that was interesting in this book is some of the attitudes towards wildlife that I see emerging have enormous parallels to the attitudes between indigenous people and the animals on the landscape. And so a number of the species that I investigate through the lens of indigenous people. So I looked at dam removals on the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula. And for that, I spent time with the lower Elwha Clallam tribe. I looked at bison recovering on the prairie in Montana. And I spent time with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe and the Blackfeet. And the sea otters and whales I investigated, I spent some time with them in northern Norway, but also in Southeast Alaska. And so I chatted with Tlingit artists and thinkers there about relationships to these animals. So what I found is when you look at animals afresh and you sort of try to figure out how can I have a changed relationship with the animal, what you find often is an attitude that has a lot of compatibility with indigenous attitudes. And let me illustrate that with one example. I looked at beaver recovery in North America. And so beaver have bounced back from a low of probably 100,000 to about 15 million right now. And, what are we finding that beavers are good at? Beavers are fantastic at restoring stream health. And so there's an opportunity to remove dams on a number of rivers. And while removing the big cement dams, we found that it's really quite advantageous to allow beavers to put in place dams made of sticks and mud. And we found it is so advantageous that we've been studying beavers to see how they do it. And we've been mimicking beavers. So there's a technique called building a beaver dam analog. So you go into a creek that doesn't have any beavers, and you build something as close as you can to what a beaver dam would be. And by doing that, you enable the creek to restore itself as if it had beavers on it. Mm. And so we're looking at beavers now as experts and teachers and perhaps allies and partners, animals that can help with creek restoration. And for me, there's kind of a synergy there to an older way of looking at animals, where animals are partners on the landscape, and we have a lot to learn from them. So it was kind of exciting to find this synergy with indigenous thought.
That's interesting you raised that point. I watched a film, it was actually talking about restoring a Scottish, it wasn't the London to Edinburgh line, but it was an offshoot of the London to Edinburgh line. And they were following these engineers who had found a beaver dam because there was a bit of a kind of a flood going off down this slope. And they said exactly the same things you're saying about the incredible ingenuity of how they can rig this into any space and it works. So they actually rerouted this stream to enable them to still, be able to live in this little section of water, which I thought was lovely, instead of just going in, blowing it up and, they said, well, actually, it's nice to have these guys here and they're not really damaging the rail line. So let them work, alongside us, as you say, which I thought was very progressive thinking. Okay, so you covered a lot of things there. You talked about beavers. Do you want to talk about the other two examples, the other examples of indigenous management?
Sure. So there's an interesting matter of sea otters here. So sea otters have recovered in the North Pacific. They're not recovered to what they were before exploitation for their fur, but they're getting there. They were down to a low of less than 1,000 animals, and they're now up to about 125,000 animals. And, it turns out that sea otters have enormous benefit for the near shore environment. This is the environment that people tend to exploit as well. Sea otters hang out there because they can't dive very deep. It's interesting. A sea otter can't really dive beyond about 300 feet. So the place it's going to be eating and feeding is going to be in that first little bit of the shore up to a depth of about 300 feet. What the sea otters do is they create an environment which is extremely healthy as a nursery for fish. How do they do that? Sea otters keep a lid on urchin populations. Sea otters eat urchins voraciously. The only way they can stay warm in those cold waters is by eating about a quarter of their body weight a day. So one of the things they like to eat is urchins. And that is actually good for this environment, because if you take away enough urchins, the kelp forests grow back.
Right. I've seen this in California. It's fantastic. Yeah.
And I mean, kelp forests are just fantastic ecosystems as nurseries for fish. And, the indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest over the millennia have sort of worked out, you got to have some healthy otter populations in some areas in order to have these kelp nurseries. And then if you want shellfish in other areas, you have to suppress otter populations. And so the indigenous relationship was one of a sort of patchy mosaic of landscapes where there were otters in some areas, which meant lots of kelp and lots of fish nurseries. And then other areas where there were less otters. And so there's a particular type of relationship here where you're sort of figuring out how the otter can be your friend and not annoy you too much by eating you out of shellfish. And this idea of otters being a friend, I think, is really appropriate today, because another thing a kelp forest does, as well as providing fish habitat, is a kelp forest sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. And so, I want my friends to be people who can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, because we need to do a lot of that. And so there's a possibility here of a relationship with otters, which is sort of a balanced relationship. Perhaps this might be a little metaphorical, but a partnership where otters are doing something valuable and we're getting something valuable out of it. And so these sorts of lessons emerge, I think, when you look at these animals with fresh eyes, and it's informed by the science and it's informed by what's actually going on the landscape.
Well, the symbiosis was it was part and parcel of the way native populations dealt with, because they relied on things like salmon for their diet and their livelihoods. So they weren't going to do stuff to damage the integrity of that. They were going to manage it, take what they need, but not too much, and then help keep them in good shape. So let's talk about salmon for a moment. I know that wasn't the third animal. The third animal, what was the third animal that you mentioned?
Well, I looked at the bison on the plains here.
Which is also very fascinating. I want to come back to that because I think they've introduced bison into the UK now, correct?
They have in Kent. That was one of the stories I covered. Near where my sister lives, there's bison that haven't been there for 30,000 years. It's incredible.
People must do a double take when they see that, right?
Yeah.
When they see a bison. That's wonderful. So before we get on to the salmon, there is a good point there, because you mentioned in the book the conversation with the warden, or the guy that's managing the bison, and he was saying that this would be really good for the young people. That was a comment he made. So what do you think he meant? Well, you do know what he meant, but what did he mean by that?
So if you ask the folks who brought bison back to the UK why they brought them back, the answer would be it's forest health. So, these are bison that don't live on the Great Plains. It's more like a forest animal. It's the European bison, Bison bonasus. And the answer is forest health, because you've got forests that are overgrown, full of non-native species. And Kent Wildlife Trust, who brought the bison back, said, we tried to have our loggers go out there and kind of cut the forest back into health, but they just weren't that good at it. It's something that the human can't actually do that effectively. So you bring bison back, and the bison basically eat and trample the forest back into health. So, if you said, why are these bison here? The answer would be, oh, it's a forest management practice, good for carbon sequestration, because it kind of keeps the forest kind of turning over. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that it is also good for local psychology. And, what I'm getting at here, and what the rangers were getting at here is what you said, a bison makes your head turn if you're outside of Canterbury. You're not expecting to see a bison there. And British people are not used to having large animals on the landscape. It has literally been, in the case of the bison, 30,000 years since a bison has been on that landscape. And so the idea that you can have this very managed part of the world, really quite densely populated, and somehow find space for large animals, that's kind of a little bit of a revelation. And, the children are very excited about it. The wildlife biology people are very excited about it, because it's really a change in a culture here. So an adaptation to a new sort of way to think about your environment. Yes, it does include 2,000-pound animals that, you want to sort of be aware of and be respectful of. That's good. That's an addition to the cultural environment of people in Kent.
I hope they brought more than one. Be very lonely if it was on its own. Did they bring a couple?
Well, so there's actually a strange, interesting story here. The original plan was for 3 females and then a male to come in a few months later. So they brought in the 3 females, and I saw the first one. I saw the first female to arrive right after she got there. They brought in 3 females, and after a month or so, one of the females kind of disappeared, and they thought, what's happened to this 3rd female? Surely she's not in trouble or ill health. When they went into the forest to find her, they found that she had a cough, and one of the 3 females had come in pregnant. No one had known. They'd done all the kind of blood tests and health tests and monitoring, but they didn't know that one of the females was pregnant. And so the herd was then 4, and this was before the male had arrived. And then the male arrived, and the male's pretty happy because his harem is now bigger than it was planned to be.
That's a great story. That's wonderful. Right, we've got some questions before we go back to my questions. The Tenacious Beasts give hope. How can we identify more of those creatures that are in fact threatened, and what can we give to them? How do we give them more of a chance?
So I guess this is one of the things I was trying to learn when I wrote this book. I have about 12 or 15 tenacious beasts in there. And I think, anyone in the audience could probably name another 3 or 4 that count as an animal that's kind of come close and is now coming back. And what I learned was there is a huge range of strategies. Here's one strategy. Here's the most basic strategy for how an animal can recover. Stop killing it. It sounds kind of a little bit simplistic, but it's actually true. European wolves, stop killing them and they come back. Humpback whales, sperm whales, stop killing them and they come back. Sea otters the same. So, there's some animals that require very little work. You just stop killing them and they can do the rest on their own. There's other animals that require heavy intervention and heavy involvement, and I encountered some of those species too. The Marsican bear is an interesting case in the Apennines of Italy. For about a century, there's only been 50 of them, and they've been protected for a while, but it's just taking them such a long time to come back because they get hit by cars and they get into run-ins with shepherds. So what they're doing to help these masking bears come back now is fascinating. They're pruning apple trees that have been abandoned by farmers in the foothills. They're pruning apple trees to produce fruit so that these bears can come back. Here in Montana, we want to keep apples away from bears. But in the Apennines of Italy, they're encouraging apples so that these bears can come back. So there's like an intervention by humans to help the wildlife return. And there's other interventions. When I was following owls, there's an owl species that is probably only going to survive if a competing owl species is killed. So there's another type of intervention, really sort of dramatically on the other side of the conservation spectrum, where you have to work really hard to bring it back. And it's a case-by-case basis. Some animals can do it on their own, others are going to need help, and you've got to be sort of adaptable and figure out the differences between the two.
By the way, Deborah has shared a couple of links for people about how they can share Leave It to Beaver, the benefits of beavers from Nature magazine. So yes. We'll share that with people. So while we're on this topic of salmon are an issue close to my heart because I've been tracking this for a long time with the Norwegian farms, and then they went into the Northwest. And now it's harder and harder in Massachusetts to get wild salmon. It used to be a lot easier to get non-farmed salmon. And all the issues that have occurred to decimate the wild salmon population since they introduced those farms, because they've given diseases that they never, ever had before to the wild population. So they're really decimating the wild population. So back again, is that something that you have looked into at all when you were looking at salmon with the indigenous methods of raising and cultivating salmon in the wild rivers?
So the salmon issue is really complicated. Like as soon as you kind of pull at one little string, you get a whole load of other stuff kind of come up. I mean, salmon is about habitat, but what habitat are we talking about? We're talking about the oceans, which is subject to climate change. And we're talking about the freshwater rivers where they come to spawn, which are subject to development and subject to dam building. And so it's a super complicated issue. We can think about salmon. We can think about three types of salmon reproduction, let's say. So one type is salmon living completely wild. They never see people. They never interact with human production. They're just doing their thing, migrating back and forth from ocean into river. Another type of salmon reproduction is taking place in a hatchery, where they're spending the first few months of their life under controlled conditions, and then they're released out into the ocean. And there's a lot of that going on in Alaska, for example, and in parts of the Pacific Northwest. A third type of salmon production is salmon raised in a farm. So bred in a farm, hatched in a farm, living their lives in a farm. These aren't wild salmon at all. It's really a different kind of animal. And they are sources of disease. It's very hard to raise salmon that densely populated in net pens. They're a threat to wild populations. When they escape, there's the possibility of inbreeding with wild populations. And so, though they do provide cheap salmon for people to eat, they really are quite a hazard to wild populations. So, moving back over the spectrum, are hatcheries better? Because at least in hatcheries, the salmon lives most of its life in the wild. There's some complicated questions there, and I try and wrestle with them in the book. Complicated questions about maintaining genetic health, because if you're making the first few months of an animal's life easier than it would otherwise be, you're compromising the genetics of the species.
And then also, in that same equation, if you're stressing an animal, you're actually making the actual food source contaminated with stress hormones. And what quality of life do these animals have? I mean, they're injected with colors to make them pink. And I mean, the whole thing is just bizarre to me, totally bizarre. Anyway. So I'm advocating for the salmon today.
Yeah, well, there's something exciting about salmon living entirely wild.
Oh,
They're relying on their smarts, they're relying on good genetics, they're relying on quality habitat. I mean, I think the goal should be to have healthy wild populations of salmon, which is what indigenous people lived off for millennia.
mm.
Dam removals are perhaps a little kind of crack and a little window into that possibility of salmon living wild, spawning wild. If we could remove a lot of dams, we would open up a lot more salmon spawning habitat.
Okay, a couple of people. Deborah's put another link up about buffalo, about the Buffalo Project. So maybe you should have a little reference with buffalo, since people have been asking about it. And then we're going to move on to birds. People are asking about birds.
Sure. I mean, bison, buffalo, bison, it's the same animal. There's a European species that I mentioned in restored to Kent. And then there's two subspecies in North America, the woods bison and the plains bison. And both the woods bison and the plains bison are recovering. It's a good news story. They are tenacious beasts. They want to live. And if we create appropriate conditions, they can live. And they're doing well. They're up from a population which at its lowest was somewhere sort of between 300 and 500 animals in North America for the plains bison. And they're now up to 500,000. So some people say that means that the species is now safe, but there's a wrinkle, there's like a complexity there. And that complexity is that the vast proportion of those 500,000 bison that exist are, one, bred on farms for meat, and two, they have cattle genes in them. And so if you are a purist about bison genetics, you would say that the 470,000 bison that are being bred for meat and have cattle genes in them are hardly real bison.
Wow.
That's sort of a compromised animal.
Mm.
And so then the interesting question becomes, okay, for those 30,000 or so animals that are not being bred for meat and they're living fairly wild in some cases, does the genetics of those animals, is that super important? And can we keep those 30,000 bison free of cattle genes? And there's a very sort of complex debate here in genetics about whether that's possible, whether it's too late, whether it matters. What do you gain from this genetic purity? And I follow that debate in the book, and it's really pretty fascinating.
Okay, we've got another, I don't know if you can answer this, but are there groups working on saving any of the bird species? She said, we are losing songbirds in particular.
So I didn't, in this book, I sort of had a few kind of tangential encounters with bird species. And none of them were songbird species. But I tracked a debate in the Pacific Northwest here about how to keep the northern spotted owl alive in the face of what some people will call the invasion of the barred owl. The barred owl is a bigger species. It's originally an East Coast species, but it's now on the West Coast. And it's really making the lives of northern spotted owls difficult. And biologists are trying to figure out if there's ways to give the northern spotted owl a chance in the face of the invasion of the barred owl. Another species that I encountered was the griffon vulture in the Apennines of Italy. And griffon vultures are returning, so it's good news. But it's one of those returns that requires a lot of effort and painstaking sort of plans to make sure that these animals have enough of the carrion that they need to scavenge on. So griffon vultures lost a lot of their population because farmers thought they were killing sheep. Vultures don't kill anything. They eat dead animals. Mm. And so once this was sort of realized, there was no longer any need to kill them. But there was a need to make sure they had enough dead meat to feed on. And since the EU had been mandating that farmers clean up their dead livestock in order to prevent disease, these vultures that started to come back didn't have anything to eat. And so the biologists had to create vulture restaurants where they literally put out carcasses so that these returning vultures had something to eat. And this has given them a toehold or a claw hold, I guess, on the landscape. And the hope is that, I mean, obviously you don't want to sustain vulture restaurants for the rest of time. The hope is that if you can get a resurgence of animals like deer or like, hardy wild breeds of cattle that are doing natural grazing on the landscape, and if you can allow some return of predators, such as the wolf in Europe, you can start getting more carcasses on the landscape. And if you've got more carcasses on the landscape, these scavenging birds, like these griffin vultures, are going to have a better time of it. So there's a way for it all to kind of work out together here if you get recovery across these different species levels.
Okay, we're going... somebody's asking about how did the larger owls get to the West Coast, but I guess it's rather like, why have we got all these pythons in Florida right now? I mean, I guess someone took one or a half a dozen and led it into the waterways, and I guess
it is actually a pretty interesting story, and it's a bit of a live debate, but it's to do with that they were originally prevented from making it from the East Coast to the West Coast by the Great Plains. The Great Plains didn't have enough trees on them for the owls to nest over the several generations that would have taken them to cross the continent. But when settlers moved into the Great Plains, they did two things. First, they planted trees, which gave the owls somewhere to nest. And second, they killed beavers. And if you kill beavers, you get a lot more vegetation, shrubs and small trees growing. So the prevailing theory is that settlers created a bridge of trees which allowed these barred owls to move over several generations from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so humans were involved in this migration across the country, and now there's this problem for the spotted owl.
I didn't think you'd know the answer to that. I'm amazed. Look at that. We're a source of all solutions to all your questions. So humanity has constantly attempted since the Anthropocene to re-engineer, you say, the planet. So who do you hope to get to through this book? Who's your audience?
So before this book, I wrote a book called The Synthetic Age, which was literally about turning the planet into this artifact that humans had designed, and all these technologies that from the atom to the atmosphere re-engineer the planet. But what I learned in that book is that often what humans can't successfully re-engineer is biology. There's too much sort of chance. There's too much random goings on in the living world. And so the living world always kind of pushes back. And so in this book, I'm talking a lot about the living world and how it pushes back. And this message is really supposed to go out to anybody who wants to feel the hope that wildlife can present to us. And, just going back to COVID, when those animals started showing up, people felt really good about that. We were all stuck in our homes, sort of wondering, what was going to happen in the future. And we looked out our windows and we saw these animals coming back, and it injected into, I think, people's consciousness, sort of a sense that like there's a world out there that is still ticking, that is still doing its thing, even in the face of this crisis we were going through. And so with this book, I want to remind people that there is an exciting living world out there. And it's often a living world that really works to our advantage in some cases. I mentioned the otters and the whales and the beavers. Species we can kind of live alongside. We can benefit from the services they provide if we can figure out the complexity of cohabitation. And sometimes it is complex, but if we can figure that out, we get to benefit from it too. And so I'm trying to, my audience really is anybody who is excited by the living world. And those people, I want them to feel the possibilities here. Sort of imagine what this future could look like, and then advocate for it, because some of this requires some changes in policy. We have to sort of, once we've decided what the vision of the future is that we want, we have to advocate for that vision. So that's kind of the goal. That's the message in here.
So the general tone out there, outside of your book, is one of kind of common despair. We see this in, David Attenborough's documentaries, Greta Thunberg, you say, having a vision of the possible is much more likely to generate results than focusing on the stream of depressing news, which is a good point. However, for so long, the environmental movement's been raising the alert to, some would say, to deaf ears. Think about the oil industry, the pesticide industry, and nothing happened. So many of us feel that we're living now on borrowed time, and it's so hard then to stand back and not see the big picture as being bleak. So what do you say to this, and what action should concerned people take? I mean, I know that's not your bag, but in terms of, should they become kind of nature observers and start taking stock and counting numbers of fish and checking bird counts? And what would you say is a good way of putting your energy out there with this kind of dire kind of prognosis?
Yeah, so, first of all, I want, the prognosis is dire, right? So I'm not denying that. But I want people to have just kind of a taste of a different possibility, just like a tiny little kind of inkling that there's another way this could go. So that's like a primary purpose here. Now, once you've got that inkling that this could turn around and go a different way, then the problems are, not to be too sort of academic about it, but the problems are structural. It's not like any one individual can sort of bring all wildlife species back. It's structural problems in terms of things like, how we do agriculture, how we do building, how we do water management, how we do forest management. And so these are political issues, and, they require people to make their views known. So, big picture is these are structural changes that take quite a while. But, you can make progress. And it was 2 weekends ago that the United Nations agreed to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030. Now, if you genuinely protect 30% of the oceans, if you've got 30% of the high seas where fish can breed unmolested, unhindered by human efforts, you've got incredible refuges there. And fish are so prolific that you could get remarkable recoveries of species. And so if people can advocate for those kinds of changes, I think dramatic shifts are possible. And that's the exciting thing about these stories, I think. Dramatic shifts are possible. And at a personal level, you've got to wear your values on your sleeve. You've got to get involved in citizen science. You've got to speak up about the benefits of wildlife. You've got to do what you can to create microhabitats in your backyard, if you have a backyard, or maybe volunteer locally. Those don't solve the structural problems, but they put your values out in the world. You're expressing your values when you do those things. And I think that's terribly important while we work on those structural problems too.
It's good advice. It's very good advice. So you recommend a couple of books, which we're going to put into the Q&A there. George Monbiot's Feral, and you like Isabella Tree's Wilding. But just before we leave this kind of fairyland that we're all enjoying, the bisons and the beavers, sharing the planet, of course, doesn't come without its perils. And we know this because everybody is vying for diminished territory. So, of course, we are encroaching on wildlife territory, like polar bears. And similarly, they have to come into our backyards, elephants and tigers and what have you, in other parts of the world where they're taking their habitat away. So, of course, I was a bit concerned this week. The avian flu is everywhere. The biodiversity reporter on The Guardian has been talking about the bird populations off the northwest of England the wild bird populations being decimated by this, which is new. It used to be in domestic populations of birds. And also it's gone from birds to mammals and mink and sea lions. So the question is, are we next for this? So your roadmap to coexistence is a nice one, but I think it's got a lot of potholes because of this particular issue of cramped space. Now we've got climate refugees, again, being forced out of their areas because no water, no food. So that's another tier. Now we've added on to this wildlife crisis, as we've got the humans fighting about the very resources that also they need, right?
So, we're obviously very sensitized at the moment to disease and flu-like diseases, contagious diseases, for obvious reasons because of COVID. I don't see, I'm not an expert on this, so, I'm speaking a little bit out of line here. But I don't see that as bumping up against the wildlife recovery discussion that I'm kind of engaged in this book. I mean, the avian flus are often sourced from, raising birds for food and keeping them in too close a proximity. And then those flus escape and infect wild populations. And, indeed, this is like a growing kind of crisis. Many of the species that I talk about as recovering are species that, we've actually sort of lived among, and they've been around us for many generations, and are probably not likely to be the sources of those kinds of diseases. And so, while I agree that there are some sort of serious potential worries when people interact with animals in new ways, and often connected to ways we produce and eat animals. Though I think, yes, there are some serious concerns there, and it's worth stepping carefully and investigating very carefully how some of these zoonotic diseases do get transmitted. I think one can keep that fairly separate from the question of animal recovery, because some of these wildlife populations have been so depleted over the last few centuries, they would have to come a long, long, long way back before we sort of end up with these, difficult questions about, who's taking up too much space. There's really like a long way to go before I see that as a worry in the kind of environments I'm talking about.
I guess this ties in actually to good management again, which is an indigenous approach to stewardship. We probably wouldn't have the problem that we're having with what deer population in New England and Martha's Vineyard and Connecticut, if there was a proper culling going on of the deer population. And because it isn't managed, we've now got huge problems with Lyme disease, which is everywhere, because of the proximity of the deer to other domestic animals, to rabbits, to birds. And it's all this huge cauldron of Lyme. So there's another example of lack of management. Good management sometimes involves, I guess, culling to enable, good health. It
can, but predators are pretty good at culling too. One of the exciting things about the wolf returning to the Netherlands is that the wolf is going to do something about the huge overpopulation of wild boar and of roe deer that they're struggling with in the Netherlands right now. And they're spending a fortune paying government sharpshooters to go out and reduce these boar and deer populations. And the wolf that is returning is starting to, do a bit of that itself. So this is sort of another case where there are win-wins here. That there are some win-loses, but there are win-wins, and I just think it's so valuable to kind of focus in on the win-wins and make those happen, and then figure out ways to deal with the lose situations and adapt and see what you can do there.
We've also got more connected articles, again, from Deborah. Deborah's very plugged in from the Cleveland Clinic on infected birds shedding viruses. So if anyone wants to have a look at that. So we're running out of time here, and I did want you to share the narrative in the book, which is so moving and powerful. I don't know if you've got a copy of it there, but you talked about the encounter you had with some wolves, 2 wolves, which was unexpected in Canada, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't know if you've got it there to read. Have
Yeah,
you?
I have. That's what the book looks like. I got it. Do you want me to read that section?
Yeah, it'd be lovely.
Sure. So this is actually also in the start of the book, where I'm sort of starting to feel I want to say something about carving a new relationship with animals. And I was up in Canada. I'd gone to give a talk at a university in Calgary. And I was on my way home. And so I'm going to just read a little paragraph here. On a rural road in Canada a few Octobers ago, I pulled the car over to stare at 2 long-legged animals loping confidently through an adjacent field. They trotted nonchalantly along, not far from several dozen unconcerned cows. I'd never seen a wolf outside a national park before, but I knew instantly what they were. When I lowered my window, the pair of wolves stopped and stared directly at my vehicle. There was an assertiveness in their look. They belonged on the land. As I admired the luster of their coats and the muscled curve of their haunches, I felt my place in the world shift just a notch. The feeling was uplifting, but at the same time, mildly disorienting. I had not expected them there. Something in my mind had to shift. The wolves finally grew tired of looking, bumped shoulders, and resumed their lope across the field. I drove the car back onto the road with electricity coursing through my blood. The feeling did not fade for many miles. It persists in the pages of this book. These animals taught me something, like I was so surprised to see them. And they were so happy to be, they were claiming that landscape, and they did it with nonchalance and with confidence. And just the beauty of their muscled haunches, the feeling didn't leave me. And actually talking about it now just reminds me of the power of that moment.
Something very palpable about those encounters and memorable, right?
Absolutely.
As you say, they shift your place really in the universe, and they shift your thinking, which is important. I don't know if we've got time for that last little business with the salmon. I mean, there's a lovely Chinook salmon paragraph, but anyway, you wanted to add the last thought when you left the salmon in the book there, if you've got time to read that.
Yeah, if I might. So, this book's about shifting perceptions. And at the end of the book, I shifted my perception again. I shifted away from like a 2023 conception of animals. I wanted to move my mind 50 years, 100 years forward into the future. And so in this passage I'm going to read, I've just seen some salmon in the mountains, 600 miles from the ocean, 4,000 feet above sea level. Incredible tenacity that these animals got there. But then I thought about something else. There was one more thought I had as I left the salmon behind that evening. There will come a day when Earth's human population will peak. It may be shortly after the middle of this century, it may be later. Up to that moment, Earth biodiversity is grinding its way up a hill like an ancient roller coaster, slowing so much it looks like it may never make it to the top. Each loud clack is a doubt about what will be left behind. But when it does reach the crest, the long struggle against gravity will finally flip to become an accelerating freefall. Millions of bodies will slither, fly, and hop their way back onto soils and waters released from service to human needs. Seeds will float in and take hold, rhizomes will reach outwards from their strongholds, and life-giving spores will alight on surfaces previously covered by crops and cement. There will be a joyous free-for-all as uncountable numbers of fins, hooves, paws, and carapaces rush onto newly liberated spaces. As Earth has done repeatedly in the past, life will bounce back. Recovering wildlife are the reservoirs that will fill out the green and blue spaces recolored in a map. The work we do now will be a bridge to a world we can only dream of. Trickles of possibility will become cascades of life as animals regain the room to flourish. Just as we did for thousands of years in the past, our species will start to remember an ancient wisdom born of entanglement with the lives of animals. We will find ourselves bending once again to the pull of biological forces that never fully went away.
Ooh, powerful stuff, that, Christopher. Well, we've come to the end of our talk, unfortunately. I'd like to thank you so much for sharing the book and your observations. It gave us kind of a momentary reprieve in this chaotic world for an hour. And I encourage everyone to go outside for a walk. Just hearing the birds and seeing things moving around just puts you in perspective, and it's a tonic to do that. So Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Foundation, the Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and of course you. Thanks everybody for joining us today, particularly Christopher, and we look forward to seeing you on March the 28th. Don't forget to buy the book, Tenacious Beasts. Thank you.